sounds of an open plan office. Welcome to our presentation on the draft standard ISO 22955, acoustic quality of open office spaces. I'm very pleased to be part of this conference and was excited to see what was on the programme this afternoon, so I hope you're enjoying it as much as we are. So my name's Jack Harvie-Clark, and these are the other people that co-wrote this presentation. These are the other people who turned up to the meetings and made a contribution to the standard, which was under this subcommittee. The purpose of this standard, so why do we need a standard for acoustic quality in open office spaces? Well, we know from the largest survey of occupants of open plan, or of all types of offices, that offices are failing people and they're failing their organisations. And we know from research that they've done on home surveys that actually most people's home offices enable them to be far more productive than the workplaces that have been provided for them in offices. In old-fashioned or traditional offices, if you like, not in home offices, noise levels have been described as the most common challenge in enabling productive conditions for people, with an average satisfaction of just 34%. And nearly half of all workspaces have less than 30% satisfaction with noise levels. This is obviously a terrible situation, but something which we as acousticians need to help with. The timeline for this standard then was, this was the first meeting in December 2017, and there was a draft, you might have seen that, came out last year, and the final standard is supposed to be produced this year. The vision for the standard came from ISO 3382 Part 3, in that defines acoustic parameters, indicators for open plan office spaces, but it doesn't really define target values. There are some values in an informative annex, but the French standard is the starting point for this standard, and that takes a different type of approach, which is to consider different types of workspaces, different types of work, and what are the acoustic challenges and needs for different types of work. And that's where this standard starts from. It's meant to be a guide for both acousticians and non-acousticians, to inform everybody involved in the design process for open plan offices what good acoustics might look like. The scope, the standard is arranged around describing acoustic challenges and requirements for different types of space. Main activities are classified as either vacant floor plates where the activity isn't known, that's actually in an annex, a contact centre where the main activity is on the telephone, collaborative workspace where the main activity is talking to people close by you, your immediate neighbours, individual work where the main activity is individual concentrative activities, so not talking to your immediate neighbours mostly, receiving the public, so you can think of banks or estate agents, for example. They're also workspaces for the people who work there, and there's a section on combining activities. So this is actually in the annex of the standard. These are all from the draft standard, these tables, so that you can see how it's set out. What are the challenges? What's the description of those challenges? Are there target or required values? So for vacant floor plates, before an activity type is known, there's requirements for general amount of sound absorption, limiting external noise, limiting internal noise that may be intrusive, achieving sufficient levels of sound insulation between divided up spaces, and enabling the building to be divided up in future, if it isn't already, to provide reasonable standards of sound insulation. For a contact centre where the work is mostly on the telephone, and this is the way the subsequent tables go, there are three types of interaction described: at the workstation, between workstations, and across the floor plate. So for each of these, the challenges and target or required values are identified. So for a contact centre, the aim is to improve intelligibility at the workstation, but maintain overall noise levels so they're not too high to enable good intelligibility on the telephone. Between workstations, the aim is to reduce intelligibility, to enable discretion. So there's a minimum requirement for attenuation between workstations, and I'll talk a bit more about that parameter later. Across the floor plate, the aim is to prevent noise levels becoming too high again. In spaces for collaborative work, the challenges are to enable good intelligibility to the nearby people within an environment that's probably slightly quieter. So that's a target value, the 52 dB, not a required value. Between workstations, communication needs to be easy, so there's a limit for the attenuation between workstations, so that communication is easy between adjacent workstations. But across the floor plate, there's a need to reduce spatial decay, reduce speech as it goes across the floor plate. So there's high values for the spatial decay of speech and speech levels at 4 meters. For individual work, there's an anticipation that the environment will be slightly quieter again. Between workstations, there's a high level of discretion required, so you don't want to hear people talking round about you if you're doing individual work. So again, across the floor plate, there's high values for the spatial decay of speech and lower values for the speech level at 4 meters. In spaces for receiving the public, the considerations are slightly different and set out in a slightly different way, as you can see here. So the summary of criteria for the 3 main types of space then. The target values for the ambient noise, you can see, get quieter as we go down here. And this parameter, the in situ attenuation of speech, is a type of speech strength. So this is the attenuation, it's described as the attenuation from 1 meter in the free field for an omnidirectional source compared to the level at the receptor position in the room. So it applies for a particular pair, a source and receiving position in a particular room, and it tells you how speech decays from one position to another. Reverberation time remains in this standard. We had many debates about whether it should or shouldn't be in there, and I'm sure that debate will continue. You can see the required values for the spatial decay of speech and the the speech level at 4 meters end up all in fact being fairly similar. So these are high values that are going to require high screens or even full height screens in some cases between different areas across a floor plate. So this implies a not very open plan office, but maybe that's what you need to get good acoustic conditions. The section on combining activities was an invention of the committee, and it suggests a matrix as an example. So how can we consider the acoustic protection from one area to another? And the aim is to get to describe this in terms of that parameter, the in situ attenuation of speech, DAS. So it does this by conceiving of areas of increasing sound emission like this and increasing sensitivity across here. We use the liveliness rating to inform so that the difference between the liveliness rating informs the type of signal to noise ratio that you might want. So a more sensitive area will have a higher level of protection from a particular source, even a higher level of protection from a source that produces a higher level of sound emission. So these numbers shouldn't be regarded as achieving good acoustics in all conditions, because it depends on the context to a significant extent. And an obvious example of that is, do people have control over where they sit? Some people like to sit next to meeting tables and either listen to what's going on or put earphones in. For other people, that would be an intolerable position. So having choice over where you sit is probably the most important thing that determines the level of acoustic protection a particular workstation needs in practice. So if we assume background sound levels like this that are going to provide the masking sound, we can use the combination of the signal to noise ratio and the background sound level we know what normal speech level is to determine the in situ attenuation of speech. So this is the table that appears in the draft standard. So different values between different types of spaces as an example. There are a series of annexes which provide helpful information. So there's a description of the measurement or calculation, the in situ attenuation, DAS, speech. There are process flowcharts for understanding the process of designing an open plan office for acoustics. There's one on the collective use of etiquette. So what type of things can people share between themselves? How can people agree a set of rules about what sort of noises are reasonable in an open plan office? If people feel that they're in control of their environment, they're much more likely to feel happier in it. So this is about how much control can we give people in their environment. There's a standard survey on acoustic comfort, which can help draw out what's the particular acoustic issues for people in a particular office. Is it telephones ringing? Is it people talking? Is it one particular person? Is it whatever it is? That's always compiled anonymously. And there's lots of statistical data that comes out of that survey too. There's an annex on measuring the ambient noise level in use, minimum requirements for that, and sound masking systems. So sound masking systems were probably the most contentious question in this standard. For some people in some parts of the world, they would never design an open plan office without one. They're essential. For other people, they could never tolerate. They've tried them and they could never tolerate them in practice. They're intolerable. So this standard is built on or built without an assumption that you can use masking sound to achieve good discretion or reduce distraction. It's all based on the room. If you take one of those polarised positions, then I would encourage you to seek out someone who takes the opposite polarised position and find out where they're coming from. Why do they think so differently from you about sound masking systems? So to conclude, we hope this standard will improve understanding and expectations about acoustic performance in open plan offices, and it will improve acoustic conditions, we hope, for occupants. It offers new methods in doing that and new ways in thinking about it, and it offers clear design goals. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope there are plenty of questions.